As the chairman said, the topic of France is now assumed at an enormous relevance because of the election first of Mitterrand as the president, and then the landslide victory of the Socialist Party and the enormous majority of the Socialist Party and the Communist Party combined in France. And of course, the situation in France today and the world situation is in many respects different. The balance of forces is different from that it existed in 1936. But obviously, as Marxists, we analyze the history of the past struggles and past developments, such as the Popular Front in 1936, in order to draw the necessary lessons and conclusions in relation to present-day events and the perspective for the next period. And while there's differences in the balance of forces and in the composition of the parties, we can already see that as far as the ideas are concerned, the idea of the Popular Front is not being called a Popular Front in France at the present time, but the political ideas and the strategy and tactics that were put forward under the name of the Popular Front are once again, in many respects, being revived in France by the leadership of the Communist Party and Socialist Party. And they're using many of the arguments that were used in 1936 to justify such an alliance, and the particular program that was put forward in 1936 to justify the program that they put forward at the moment. The program at the moment, by the way, goes a lot further in many respects than the Popular Front program of 1936. But nevertheless, the idea that it's a halfway stage towards socialism, that it's not in itself a socialist transformation of society, but it's a step forward away from capitalism, according to their arguments, and a step on the road towards the complete transformation of society. And obviously, we have to go into that to understand exactly what it means, what the implications are as far as the working class are concerned. As far as we're concerned, disastrous implication because of the misconception and the false idea of popular frontism, which will again in the future lead to the defeat of the workers unless the workers are able to push that leadership aside and a genuine Marxist leadership with correct ideas and correct perspective. Now, probably up until the present time, there's been relatively little discussion in the labour movement generally, and even in our own tendency, on the events in France. They are overshadowed to some extent historically by the more momentous events in Germany, of course, where Hitler came to power and the labour movement was smashed and defeated in 1933. And on the other hand, by the Spanish Revolution, which was also set in motion in 1936 by the election of the Popular Front in Spain, and where the 3 years of civil war, of really revolution and civil war in Spain, tended to overshadow the events in France, or Britain for that matter, and some of the other countries. And for that reason, there's probably not so much general knowledge of France as there is of Spain and some of those other countries. And that's all the more reason to go into that now. But despite the relative overshadowing, if you like, we can see that the events in France in 1936 were a real revolutionary movement of the working class, that the theoreticians of the Communist Party and the experience of the Communist Party now want to argue, well, it was because it was the movement, it was the general strike, but it wasn't the real revolutionary situation. It wasn't like Russia in 1917, and they imply that only if you have a situation like Russia, where the Kerensky government was brought in on the wave of revolution in February 1917, and then within the space of 9 or 10 months, it led to an insurrection by the working class and the siege of power by the working class. And let the events take that highly concentrated and telescope form, which they did in Russia because of the conditions in Russia, the situation created by the war and so on, and also the presence of the Bolshevik Party, that's true. But unless they take that concentrated form, it can't be a revolution. But yet in France, we have the situation where in the general strike that broke out with the election of the Popular Front, when there were really two general strikes, the first one lasted a few days, and it came to an end with the Whitsun bank holiday because the workers weren't sure of the situation. They felt they'd make gains and then they went back. And then after the Whitsun holiday, there was an even longer and more profound general strike. And this general strike, according to most history books, involved at least 1 million workers. And this is what the capitalist press internationally said at the time. And more reliable estimates are, and it's very difficult to say, but it was at least 1.5 million. And we can say possibly even 2 million workers were involved in the strike action. Now, of course, the general strike in itself doesn't make a revolution, but consider exactly what happened. That the trade unions were very weak in France compared with, say, Britain or Germany. There was a tradition of spontaneity. There weren't such powerful, consistent organizations that have been developed in France. There was real percentage organized, but nevertheless, there was an enormous mushrooming of the trade unions. That workers who never before were involved in strike action were drawn into the battle. And the strike began in the one of the aircraft factories, one of the more modern industries in France, the big aircraft factory. It quickly spread to Renault, in Blanco, where the May 1968 general strike also began, which is the subject of a later film. And the strike quickly spread to all the engineering industry, the big industry, where, of course, you'd expect the industrial workers to be involved, but it wasn't just that. If you read the accounts, and I won't have time to go into all the details, but I think that if you can find the book, or even go to newspapers like The Guardian that had very good reports at the time compared with other newspapers, you'll find that the scale of activity was enormous, and that the strike action embraced the most exploited workers in the country. Whereas all the big stores, as France was the country par excellence of big stores, which hardly existed in most other countries, and they were world famous. They were the luxury stores of the bourgeoisie and the middle classes, and the workers there were not unionized, were not politicized, and they went on strike, and they organized occupation. And that was another thing, that the strike it was just the general strike, but it really developed a new form of strike action, which was the sit-in strike, or the occupation, where the workers took over the factories. That they quickly set up committees, they organized the security, they organized workers and so on for the pickets and for food and supplies and all the rest of it. And there was a really incredible movement to the left of it. Was a movement from below that took the leaders of the Communist Party and the Communist Party trade union by surprise, as much as it took the bosses by surprise. And the extent of the strike is incredible. There was one that was covered by the lot in Britain because it's the British firm, but the Palmers, the biscuit firm, and by appointment to the royal family, etc. And there were pictures in the Illustrated London News of the Huntley and Palmers workers all wearing their good uniforms. They had these old-fashioned aprons. They're mostly women workers, but they were either in committee or they were organising dancing in the factory. And the worst thing of all, to the point of the bourgeois, that they actually locked the management into the offices during the course of the occupation, and they agreed to leave them. They didn't ill-treat probably made them eat their biscuit, but they obviously had a revolutionary attitude, that they weren't going to let the bosses out. And there was this feeling that there was an enormous overturning of society, that the workers for a period actually took power into their hands. Now, if that's not a revolutionary situation, or a situation where a party that had any serious intention of a transformation of society, that had any real understanding of how to change society, that would have been the beginning of a struggle for power. Because even though the outcome was economic improvement, even though the issues, if you like, from the beginning were the economic conditions, particularly the working day, the 40-hour working week, of paid holidays, there were no paid holidays at that time, and the removal of various arbitrary disciplinary things, as well as an increase in the minimum wage. That it began with economic demand, of course, but you can never limit a general strike of that character to economic demand, because the very fact that the workers left the factory, that they sell the buses or they lock the buses into their offices, means that for a time the workers have the power in their hands. And while it was going on, just as in May 68, although it wasn't on such a big scale, that it paralyzed the forces of the state and society. That the police were sympathetic, they couldn't be used. None of the reactionary dared to, demand even the expulsion of the workers in the factories. It was even raised in the assembly, and they said to Bloom, "Look, you are presiding over illegal occupations have done." And he said, "Well, I agree they're illegal, but is any member of the assembly proposing that I send in the police to expel them?" And he kept saying, "Are you? Do you want the police to go in?" And there was not one deputy in the assembly who dared to say they should send the police in. And he said, "No, of course not. Even the bosses don't say send the police or the army in, because they know that would mean civil war and a conflict." And in that, even in saying that, Bloom, if you like, more than the CP leaders at the time, recognized the enormous power of the working class. Even the fascist league, the so-called Father, the Cross of the Fire, which was put forward as a bogey, and is still put forward by the CP historians as a bogey, if you like, that these fascist leagues were very powerful, that they could have seized the power, that they would have to take the strike further with the triggers a counter-revolution. But even they were not to be seen anywhere in Paris or the main industrial cities during the course of the strike. And there are accounts that I'd read recently that by the Guardian correspondent points out that in the factory that these members of the fascist league, or people that support them, might have disappeared completely, and there were a number of cases where they were put on trial, that the workers set the pickets around and dragged them out. And they put them on trial in the factory, which is partly a serious court-martial, but they were also subject, as you can imagine, to enormous ridicule. And then they were just laughed out of the factory, that they chased them out of the factory. They, never come back. And that's the way they were treated. But there were even some of them who were previously supported the Croix de Fer, and they renounced it, and they joined in the strike, and they said, we support it. And in fact, the leadership even, Delaroche, had to say that he wasn't against the economic demand of the workers, because if you like, he had to bend a bit and draw on some of the opportunistic, demagogic, anti-big business slogans of the factories, which usually took an anti-Semitic turn. And he said himself that he was against big business and he supported the demand. But even the fascists were neutralized, paralyzed during the course of this action. And of course, the question we have to ask is, why was it, when there was this enormous revolutionary movement of the workers, that it wasn't carried through into a change? And within 2 years, the Popular Front government had collapsed in chaos. There was another general strike, brief general strike in 1938, because of the move of the government to take back the gains of 1936, and they did take back all the main gains, apart from the fact the workers made paid holiday. I think that was the only thing that wasn't even sort of wiped out by legislation, apart from inflation and the economic ways it was called back. Why is it that in the space of 2 years, that all the gains had disappeared? And not just that, but after the general strike of 1938, the trade union was smashed and their membership was reduced to a lower level than it had been since the early period of the 1920s, and that's of course the key question that we have to deal with. Now, before we do that, I have to go back, if you like, to fill in some of the preceding events from the point of view of the tendency within capitalism itself, and also the development of the parties, particularly, of course, the Communist Party, which wasn't just one Communist Party in France, but was part and parcel of the world, by that time, Stalinist CP, and that they were parties that were rigidly controlled at that time by the Communist International, the Comintern, from Moscow, and that they weren't the full democratic bodies of the workers, that they were really an agency of the Stalinist bureaucracy on the international arena and within France, and we have to take that into account. And as far as the tendencies within capitalism are concerned, which I tried to deal with briefly first, that has to be our starting point, because unlike the CP or the other so-called Marxists, that we don't just say, well, revolution is a good thing, that we will see any opportunity to carry through a socialist transformation society. We understand, as Marxists, that the movement of the workers is primarily, even if you have a mass communist party or a mass socialist party, that they can be decisive in a revolutionary situation, but revolutionary situations arise from profound economic and social movements. They're not just like the weather that come about accidentally and in a completely unforeseen way. And therefore, we have to view, just as when we're discussing France in the present day, we analyze the economic situation, the balance of forces in society, the class relations of done, that we have to do that for that time. What we see is that 1936 wasn't just an event confined to France, as I mentioned, but it represented a acute crisis throughout the capital world. But it was a crisis that was primarily a political crisis, or a crisis in the class relations, that came about really on the basis of a slight recovery in the capitalist world economy, and particularly in a number of the key capitalist countries. Because as you know, I don't want to go back too far in this period, but in 1929-31, that was at the end of one phase, if you like, when there was the Wall Street crash and the world economic recession, where there was an acute economic and financial crisis throughout the capitalist world that hit all the main capitalist countries. But because of the weakness of the workers and the fact that they were largely defeated at the time of the 29-31 crisis, the capitalists managed to bring about a certain stabilization on the basis of mass unemployment, a driving down of living standards, a reorganization of industry to some extent. They began to give more investment to the modern industries, that when the motor car industry, aeroplanes, electrical industry that first began to develop they were still a small part of the economy, but when they first began to develop big factories and a sector of the economy devoted to those new industries. And by 1935, 1936, there was a recovery as far as the economy is concerned in relative terms, because they were still in a general situation of dire crisis that wasn't overcome until after the Second World War, but there was relatively a recovery, and the workers began to feel more confident. There was a turn in the situation, and the unemployment began to turn down slightly. That as production picked up, the bosses always have to make some concessions in order to get more production out of the workers, and they have to give the incentive to lead the section of the working class, and the workers began to feel their strength. And that way in Britain, there was a swing to look toward the Labour Party. The Union began to be more active in 1934 and 35 in Britain, with the big unemployment struggles as well. Similarly in Spain, there was a new upsurge that brought the Popular Front there, and so on. And that this affected France as well. And that the French workers began to feel more strength, and there began to be a push, if you like, a demand for action. But because of the limits of the labour movement, it didn't really make any tangible gains until the election of the Popular Front. They were completely frustrated on the economic plane because the trade unions were weak, that they weren't effective, and the economic grievances, the industrial grievances accumulated and built up, and then suddenly, really in the last period in France, they were given the opportunity in a general election to elect the Popular Front government, and that was given what at that time was a really sweeping victory in the poll. Now, why was it that the Popular Front came about? Because in the period of the early 1930s, up until about 1933, at the beginning of 1934, there was the situation of an acute division between the mass workers' party. The Communist Party, up until that time, under Stalin, the direction ultimately, had adopted the position that they would have no cooperation with the Socialist Party, from the Social Democratic Party. And they came out with the idea of the so-called social fascism, where they argued that objectively speaking, the Socialist parties, the Social Democratic parties, were no better than fascism. That they were preparing the ground, if you like, for a capitalist reaction. They were aiding and abetting the fascists by the fact that they didn't stand for socialist revolution, and therefore the Communist Party could have nothing whatever to do with it. That obviously was a completely false and mistaken tactic, and it was dictated by firstly the failures of the CP when they had tried to implement the Lenin's genuine idea of the United Front after 1921. That had failed. Their opportunist tactics of that period failed, and so they swung to extreme ultra-left tactics, where they rejected any form of alliance or cooperation with the Socialist Party. On the other hand, again, we shouldn't have a simplistic view of this. We have to see that there's an interaction of the needs of the Stalinist bureaucracy from the point of view of the foreign policy interest of the Russian bureaucracy. On the other hand, the situation in France or the other the different countries themselves, where the CP leaders reacted to the moves and the objective situation in that country. And there's also, of course, the position of the Socialist Party leaders themselves, because they too had contributed to the split within the labour movement by the fact that they, after the Russian Revolution, had developed a anti-Bolshevik position. It was originally anti-Bolshevik. It became anti-Stalinist, because of the pressure of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie on the Socialist Party that mainly had a leadership born from the middle class, or even the sort of intellectual elements of the bourgeoisie itself. They tried to, if you like, keep their authority in the eyes of the capitalist class by refusing to have any alliance with the communists and having any policies that appeared to favour or before the Soviet Union. And therefore they contributed to the it suited them very well to have the CP say that there would be no alliance. But this change I brought about the communist president. We have to see that there are objective reasons for that. It's not just an arbitrary change on the part of the leadership. And of course, the main reason was the defeat of the working class in Germany, the devastating smashing of the workers, and the fact that the Hitler seized power and began the atomization, not just of the workers' organizations, but of the working class itself, of establishing a fascist totalitarian dictatorship, which of course meant that not just the CP leaders who were sent to the concentration camps if they hadn't escaped in direct car, but also the socialist leaders and the leaders even of radical or leftist groupings of any kind were suppressed and even murdered or later murdered by the fascist regime. So that the Socialist Party leaders themselves were forced to recognize that capitalist reaction didn't just mean that the CP would be wiped out, which they probably wouldn't have wept too many tears about, but meant that they would be wiped out as well, and that their own nets, if you like, were at stake. And therefore, they began to swing in the other direction of the Popular Front and to say the fight to the CP, that the CP, the Stalinist policy for the German Communist Party, again dictated in an arbitrary and completely undemocratic way from Moscow, contributed to the victory of fascism in Germany. But they themselves were forced to switch by the victory of Hitler. They began to look in another direction, and that they came out again from the top. There was an article in Pravda which changed the line very suddenly. It was only later that it was discussed by the executives of the Communist International and by the different bodies of the Communist Party to say, well, we have to implement the new policy of the People Front, or as it soon became then, the Popular Front. They put forward the idea of an alliance with not just with other workers' parties, which was the original idea of the Workers' Front, the United Front, but with bourgeois parties also, and on a program, not a socialism, not a socialist program, but a program that was defense of democracy against fascism. And that was given particular impetus, if you like, in France in February 1934 by the fact that there was what seemed at the time, and could have led to, a seizure of power, or the attempted seizure of power, by the fascist league in France. And so the bending of the leadership, if you like, came together with a genuine spontaneous movement from the workers for united class action. And even before the leaders had worked out the form of the Popular Front, but the workers had begun to combine together in order to defeat the onslaught of the Quadriga and the other fascist elements in France. Because in 1934, there was the culmination of a scandal that was known as the Stavisky scandal, which the details of which are extremely involved and scandalous and horrendous that I don't intend to go into at the moment. But the details, in a way, are not that relevant because they were taken to be, by the workers at the time, just symptomatic of the rottenness of the French capitalism and the government. And what it boiled down to was this capitalist who was Jewish, who was originally from Russia or part of Russia, had brought up or become the manager of a pawn shop, which may sound not very significant, but in France, for various reasons, there was a state monopoly of pawn shops, and that they had to be licensed and controlled in some way by the state. And it was found that this pawn shop appeared anyway to be making enormous amounts of money, that it issued bonds on the French stock exchange that began to be bought up on enormous quantities by various investors and speculators. And it later came to the attention of the press that perhaps there wasn't much trading actually going on in this pawn shop. Was there some rural town in France where the population wouldn't have sustained a minor pawn shop, let alone an internationally financed pawn shop. And it was found that it was being covered. There was obviously some cover-up going on. It was just a gigantic fraud, and that there were government ministers involved in this, covering up for Stavisky and the other speculators involved. Now, this is scandalous enough that the reason it took on the significance that he did, it wasn't just that the workers were infuriated, but the CP leaders and the Socialist Party leaders did very little about it. It was like the case of the Freemason scandal in Italy now, where the communist leaders and the socialist leaders also want to brush it under the carpet because they're frightened that they may be implicated in any thorough investigation of bureaucratic and capitalistic skullduggery. But you see, the fact that Stavisky was a financier, that he was involved in lots of murky deals, that he was Jewish, meant that the right wing, particularly the papers of the Cardiff First, took this up and they hammered away in one way correctly, if you like, or in justifiably on the issue of the scandal. But of course, they tried to draw the conclusion that it was because France was controlled by a clique of international Jewish financiers that were in league with the Communist Party, and other international conspirators. They were all lumped together, if you like, as there's the menace to the French nation, and they began to conduct an agitation. And they obviously, particularly to the classes that they appealed to the ex-soldiers who fought in the First World War, they were able to mobilize them on the grounds that they fought for France, and now France was being ruined and taken over by Jewish financiers who were out to bleed them dry and ruin the culture. And when it came to the assembly eventually to be debated, that was on the 6th of February in 1934. The fascist league organised an assault on the assembly, and it seemed at the time it was street fighting, and it was only barely contained by the police, and it seemed that this was the beginning of a real takeover by the fascists in France. And this is an indication, if you like, of the way in which an almost accidental feature, because this scandal in itself was nothing new. There'd been lots of scandals in France, they're probably even worse in many ways. But it shows how an event like that can precipitate action. Well, it didn't lead to an immediate attempt at a coup, and it didn't lead to the immediate overthrow of the government. There was a succession of governments up until the Popular Front election that couldn't control the situation. But it laid the impetus for the party leaders to form the Popular Front, the defense against fascism. But there was another factor, and that was that first, the Communist Party the Communist Party leaders were more interested in an alliance with the radicals than they were with the socialists. And the reason for this are clear if you understand what the main motivation of the CP leaders were under direction from Moscow. And that was because the Radical Party, which, as Trotsky explained at the time, was really a capitalist party, but it was based on the small businessmen, the rich or more prosperous, we could say, peasantry in France. Some of the professional element, particularly in rural France. It was, in other words, based on the petty bourgeoisie of France, which was still a large social strata at that time. But it was the capitalist party, the way in which the capitalists maintained their control. They were the parliamentary excluders, Trotsky said, of the middle class. But because they looked towards the stability of France, and that they feared above all the Nazi threat to France because of the danger of a popular invasion, that they'd seen Hitler invade and take over Austria, and they thought that he would attempt to do the same as far as France was concerned. That they were the fourth party in France to agitate for an alliance to the Soviet Union. They wanted a Franco-Soviet pact, a treaty, if you like, that would align the two countries in the event of Germany declaring war or invading France. And for that reason, the CP was mainly concerned with an alliance with the radicals. And they even raised the question initially of extending the alliance not to the left, but to the right. And they argued that some of the parliamentary groups that weren't the right wing as the Laval's the Conservative Party and the outright representatives of the bourgeoisie, that they should draw in the national democratic capitalist element, if you like, that would be prepared to defend French democracy against fascism within France and in Germany. And it was only really under the pressure of the workers from below who'd already begun to combine against the fascist league that they came forward with the idea of a popular front that was mainly based on the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. But as I said, it was still limited to immediate demand. That they had a number of economic demands, which came up anyway in the general strike, with 40-hour week, a paid holiday, the reforms as far as insurance and health were concerned. That it also called for the nationalization or state control of the Bank of France, which wasn't at that time completely under the control of the government, and also the nationalization. The only elements of nationalization was really the nationalization of the munitions industry, which was partly on two grounds. One was that in France, like a lot of industries that the state had an interest in, it was a gigantic fiddle for the captain and the financiers involved, and also because there was a genuine feeling, if you like, from workers that if they were being asked to prepare for the defense of the country in time, that it should actually be the state that was responsible for this event, and not the captains who were obviously just bleeding it for themselves. But apart from that, there was no explicitly socialist element in the program, and it was explicitly, on the contrary, it was explicitly put forward by both Blue and Torres, the CT leader, that this was not a program to implement socialism. And Torres came out with all the arguments that are now very familiar from CT leaders, that the situation wasn't right, that they weren't ready, that it wasn't the stage, if you like, of the socialist revolution, that it was only the stage of the defense of democracy against fascism. And he even said, and it's quite amazing if you read these statements, they said, well, it may fail, that maybe we will be able to defend democracy, but nevertheless we've got to try, and if it fails, then we'll turn to something else. That it would be adventurous and not opportune to attempt to fight with socialist program now. Well, when the government was the Popular Front was elected, the result obviously showed the movability of the workers. Right? I won't read out all the actual voting figures that I could give them, but in terms of percentages, the votes of the Communist Party went up from 8% in the 1932 election to 15% in 1936. The Socialist Party, which was a bigger party, had in 1932 had 21% of the vote. That remained slightly the same. It was a 1% fall, actually, although it managed to increase because of the peculiarities of the election. It went up from 129 seats to 149 seats. The CP got 72 seats as opposed to 12 seats in 1932. But the various left groups that were, previous leaders, mine, the CP or the Communist Party, actually got quite a big increase there. Both went up from 1% to 10%, back from 11 seats to 56 seats. You can see that the peculiarities of the constituency mean that the percentages that are not exactly the same as the number of the outcome and number of seats. And the radical socialists, who were supposed to be the kings of the Popular Front, and it was vital to sustain the alliance and vital to appease the radical socialists, who were more radical than socialists, of course. So that was a historic label that had been tacked on to them, but they weren't in any way that we would accept socialists. But their percentage votes fell from 19% in 1932 to 14% in 1936, and their seats went down from 157 to 109 seats. So those results show a clear swing to the left parties and a swing away from the radicals, and that obviously gave an enormous reinforcement to the leftward mood of the workers. Now, the election of the Common Front, as you know, precipitated the general strike. Now, that happened in France this time because we tried to explain in the paper the situation is slightly different. But the main reason that the strike was precipitated in 1936 is because the workers themselves, from the very beginning, were quite rightly very suspicious and very distrustful of the intentions of the Popular Front leaders, particularly the Prime Minister of and leader of the Popular Front, to implement the program fully of the Popular Front. And this was reinforced by the fact that Blum immediately began to make reassuring statements to the big businessmen and to the bank that he said he wouldn't devalue the franc, that they would repay the war loans and to the United States and various other things, just as Mitterrand has done. Mitterrand has been very cautious about that. He's trying to do it behind the scenes and not allow it to become a sort of prominent part of his campaign before the second round of the assembly election. But the other thing is that because of the constitutional position in France, that there was a fortnight's delay between the election and the formation or the announcement of Blum's government, which included all the representatives of parties, apart from the Communist Party, which I'll come to in a minute, that there was a fortnight delay. And of course, the workers were impatient for action. They weren't prepared to wait 2 weeks, in which God knows what might happen as far as Parliament or as far as the Constitution does, so they took immediate action. That hasn't happened this time because Mitterrand was very careful, and he undoubtedly learned a few lessons, if you like, from the 36 years, that he was careful to announce immediately, using the presidential powers, various reforms in the minimum wage, social security benefits, and other things that weren't revolutionary in themselves, but it really showed a determination in the eyes of the electorate to actually begin to implement measures that showed that he gave the impression that he was prepared to take radical measures that actually implement the program on which he's been elected, in which the Socialist Party was fighting the election. So therefore, the workers in 1936 didn't have this reassurance, and they immediately began to take this action. Now, the other difference, of course, is that in 1936, the CP hadn't degenerated to quite the level of reformism that it degenerated to at the present time. Make no mistake about this, that it was controlled by the Comintern and ultimately by Stalin. And when I say controlled, I mean that the officials of the leadership were appointed by Stalin nominally through the Comintern, but usually without consulting them. And they were left in no doubt that if they stepped out of line, that Stalin could take measures to remove them. For instance, in the case of the German Communist Party, and no doubt the French leaders knew this very well, that when a lot of them went into exile in Russia after the seizure of power by Hitler, a lot of them disappeared. They were put in jail, they were executed, there were even assassinations or disappearances of CP leaders or functionaries in the Western countries, and therefore there's absolutely no doubt that they were completely controlled and directed by Moscow. But nevertheless, they still hadn't reached the stage where they could openly advocate policies that, if you like, were so contrary to the ideas and the principles and the history of Leninism, that's they could say, well, we should enter a government with the bourgeois party. Then they didn't say that. They said that we got to support a party that a government that includes the bourgeois party, that we won't enter that government. And unlike the president's government in France, that there were no CP ministers in it. And they even went to the extent of appointing a number of ex-government ministers, if you like, outside government ministers, and they announced the formation of the so-called Ministry of the Masses, which was going to be the leaders of the Communist Party who were going to, if you like, create a new ministry which wouldn't have any constitutional or parliamentary status. It would be the ministry to look after the affairs of the working class and the toiling people of France. Well, as a propaganda movement, if you like, there's nothing wrong with it. It even has a certain flair, if you like. And I should mention, by the way, that although now when we're analysing it, it seems absolutely incredible, the policy that they carried out, that it wasn't so crude as you might imagine. And you can understand, if you read the history of the period of what happened, why many workers had enormous solutions to the CP. So they organised enormous rallies where they were spectacular demonstrations and rallies where they produced a new flag that was a red flag with a French, little French tricolour in the corner, and it said "Ara" for the French Republic, and a hammer and sickle in bright white between the RF on the thing, and that they had massive demonstrations where they gave the impression of being, as they were, a strongly organised corps, but they were serious about the change, that they were going to actually support the work of making enormous gain within the framework of the popular press. But as I said, that they were actually supplied by the general strike. They didn't initiate it. They controlled it. The BP, through the CGT, largely controlled the general strike, and that they used all their influence and all their political powers of persuasion and all their organisational weight to bring the strike to an end as soon as possible. And that's why Trotsky said, with quite rightly, without new justification, that the Popular Front was really a strike-breaking conspiracy. There was an agreement, the Malignard agreement, where the leaders of the workers met in a hotel with the bosses, and they agreed on the reforms as far as wages and conditions and the other things that I mentioned are concerned. But even that didn't satisfy the workers. That strike in most of the big industrial areas, and even as far as some of the shops and some of the less proletarian sectors of the workers, if you like, went on for at least another week. And the workers were prepared to go back on the basis of a written agreement that they feared, with good reason, that the bosses wouldn't actually implement these agreements. And they wanted personal meetings for the bosses themselves. For instance, in Renault, they insisted on meeting Mr. Renault himself to get him to say to the workers in a mass meeting that he accepted all these deals. And he refused for several days. He obviously didn't really intend to implement it originally. He sent the management to sign agreements with Don, and they were, even at that stage, hoping they could wheedle their way out of it. But anyway, they caught these agreements from the bosses individually, and in most cases they were immediately implemented with the reduction of production. Play by the CE was to gradually dissipate and diffuse the energy of the workers. As we said before, this would be raised again in the discussion on France in 1968, that a general strike can't be sustained indefinitely. General strikes are exceptional events. They arise from an enormous upsurge of the movement and the energy of the working class. It takes enormous events to precipitate a general strike. It's a result of really years of accumulated frustration and grievances and so on. And once they've begun, that they've got to go in one direction or the other. Either they're taken at the movement towards power, that the fact that the workers have seized power and taken over and displaced the bosses and the state apparatus, at least temporarily, has got to be carried through to a conclusion. And that means the workers have got to take over production, organise a plan of production to break down the old state apparatus, which would of course mean disbanding the army and the police and the state bureaucracy, and forming a new state apparatus that would be based on Soviet-type organizations that would, or workers' committees, or whatever they would be called, to involve the mass of the workers in the running of the economy, of the state, and society generally. And of course, the aim of the workers' leader, particularly the CP, was not that, and they didn't even claim it was that. They argued that they couldn't go forward to a socialist revolution, and that they were afraid, in reality, of this movement as the bourgeoisie itself, and therefore they used all their influence and their pressure to diffuse and dissipate, and they let off the steam that had accumulated to get the workers back to work. And gradually, of course, that's what happened. There was no alternative leadership. There was the left wing in the Socialist Party that was critical of the Popular Front and the policy of Blum and the CP, but it was a very amorphous and confused left wing. It tended towards pacifism, and that's a warning for now, if you like. It was preoccupied with the question of rearmament or some of them were. The others were preoccupied with getting rid of all arms. They posed the main danger before the workers would meet an invasion or whatever by Germany, and they didn't they didn't draw from that any socialist conclusion. They didn't draw the conclusion that therefore the workers must take control of society. That they had no clear policy at all as far as the workers' struggle were concerned. And the Trotskyist organizations in France at that time were unfortunately divided between at least three different groups. They were very small and ineffective, and Trotsky spent most of his time in that period writing material like the articles in With a France, for instance, the book With a France, which is essential reading, not just on France, but on the question of popular Protestantism. And they were in disagreement with Trotsky that his views didn't prevail. They were unable to implement a genuine Marxist policy as France was concerned, and therefore the weight of the communist and the socialist leaders prevailed, and that they managed to defuse, to derail a revolutionary situation in France. There was gain for the workers, but of course, in the context of a crisis-ridden economy, they simply couldn't be sustained. That only the government fell in at the end of 1937, but the Popular Front continued under the leadership of first Jean Paul and then Blum again, but they were really governments that were completely paralyzed. The Senate, the second body of the French Parliament, kept rejecting his financial bills. They refused to give him exceptional powers to take various economic measures. That the franc was devalued in spite of what Blum had promised at the beginning, inevitably devalued, which of course opened the way to more rapid inflation. That the French capitalists, right from the beginning of the Popular Front, had been sending cartloads or trainloads even of gold, the currency reserve out of the country. That's another lesson that was learned this time, that the trade unions immediately issued instructions to the captains officers in France to search cars and so on for money, and there was no doubt a lot of money was taken out of France in the last few weeks, but probably not as much as in 1936. And the economy began to go into an even worse crisis. That the inflation rose, and the bosses, as they felt their strength, began to push and push and push to take them back. And they actually provoked the general strike in 1938, letting a new conservative government that was returned under Deladier, and they provoked the workers into a general strike. Obviously, the workers felt the need to take action, but it was a strike like the 1926 general strike in Britain, which came at the end, really, of a series of defeats. It was a last-ditch defensive struggle, and without a program, without a clear conception of how the struggle could be taken forward, there was really no hope of success, and the strike was defeated. As I said, the trade union organization fell. The enormous gain in membership was wiped out, and it fell back to the level of the early 1920s. and that there were actually laws introduced, or the presidential orders that annul virtually every single concession that had been gained in 1936. The first one was the 40-hour week was abolished, and as I said, the only thing that was really maintained was the idea of paid holidays, but even that wasn't, of course, necessarily honoured, depending on the situation in the various enterprises. And of course, France slipped into more and more of a crisis that became bound up with the international crisis. And in 1939, of course, there was the outbreak of war between fascist Germany and France. And it wasn't just a war between two nation states, but the majority of the French bourgeoisie immediately capitulated. And through Pétain, they obviously created a stooge regime. That these regimes are now usually called Quisling regimes after the bourgeois stooge in Norway, but Pétain was just as much a Quisling as Quisling himself, and that they ruled part of France anyway that wasn't directly occupied on behalf of the German fascist state, on behalf of German big business, and therefore the end result of the popular front was fascism, really indirectly, not in such an acute form, but the fascist occupation of most of northern France and the industrial areas of France, and a stooge regime that was virtually as bad as the fascists in Vichy France, where of course the same conditions by and large applied. The annulment of trade union rights, there was the arrest of political activists, there was the deportation of French activists and workers, and of course the Jewish population of France to concentration camps in Germany or Poland, and so on. In other words, the workers suffered the worst consequences of the victory of fascism in Germany and on a European scale, and that was the outcome of popular feminism. Now we have to draw the conclusion, which would seem obvious to any one who studied the ideas of Marxism, whether it's Marx himself or Lenin or Trotsky, but even we'll say for the benefit of the CPers, that for even of Lenin's ideas, that this wasn't just an accidental thing, that it wasn't just that this strategy could have worked, but it didn't work under the circumstances of what they say in relation to Chile, of course. Well, there was nothing necessarily wrong with the strategy, but you can't guarantee that it's always going to work. There is some grain of truth in that argument generally, that even if you adopted a correct policy, you can't guarantee that a revolution will be carried through, that it will be successful. Of course not. But what you can say is that if you start out with the policy of popular frontalism, then it's guaranteed in advance that unless the workers can overcome that and throw aside the leaders who are actually implementing that policy, it's unfortunately predetermined that the working class will be led to defeat and suffer a devastating reaction in a relatively short time. And that was undoubtedly the consequence at that time, that they'd taken the idea of the United Front, put forward by Lenin and Trotsky in the Communist International in 1921, where they argued, of course, that if the communists were in a minority, or the communist trade unions and the Communist Party was in a minority, they had to form an alliance with with other parties, that was Workers' Party, and that the alliance had to be formed not just from above as an agreement to the convenience of the leaders, from below. In other words, there should be action committees, or in other words, Soviet type of organizations that bound the workers together in actions to actually fight fascism, not just say they were defending democracy against fascism, but to actually clear the fascists from the street, to sustain and develop the power of the workers, and above all, that the different workers' parties, and of course the Marxist Party involved in the United Front, would preserve its own parties and its own ideas, and that those parties would have to be an independent policy of the mobilization of the workers for a program of the socialist transformation of society, with the aim of the seizure of power by the working class. And of course, the Popular Front conception contradicted that, and was a barrier against that right from the very beginning, and we have to draw the lesson. I just say to end that obviously we wouldn't argue that the situation is exactly the same in France today, that the workers are much stronger that even if the defeat because of the policy of Mitterrand and the French CP leadership, with the French CP now in the government, that it would be wrong to assume that it will be like Chile, that within 3 years there will be a bloody and devastating counter-revolution, that the work of the much more powerful in France, the question the effect on the other European working class. But nevertheless, we can say with certainty that it can't lead to success as far as the work of the done, that even reform will be implemented, maybe. The capitalist class will take a step backwards in order to prepare for a reaction later as the economy moves into low-density and the workers begin to be disillusioned with the socialist and the communist leaders. But nevertheless, it is a recipe for defeat for exactly the same reason that the Popular Front government was the recipe, or Popular Frontism was the recipe for defeat in 1936. And we have to draw the lessons, we have to study it thoroughly. The comrades will be discussing it now, but we have to thoroughly discuss and assimilate those lessons in order to apply them to the task that face not just the workers in France at the present time, but the workers in Britain and in other countries where there will also be moves toward popular frontism in the future.